For 15 years, Maya Jensen believed the jagged scar across her face was a reminder of the fire that nearly killed her as a child. But when a renowned surgeon examines her mark and questions everything her parents told her, Maya discovers that some scars hide darker secrets than others. What if the tragedy that shaped your entire identity was actually the cover-up for something far more sinister? What if the people you trust most have been lying to you your whole life? Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will thrill your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. Maya Jensen pressed her fingertips against the bathroom mirror, her reflection staring back with eyes that carried the weight of 15 years marked by whispered comments and stolen glances. The fluorescent light above cast harsh shadows across her face, making the raised, twisted flesh that carved a jagged path from her right temple to her jawline appear even more pronounced. The scar resembled a lightning bolt frozen in time, its edges rough and discolored, a permanent reminder of what her parents had told her was the worst night of her childhood, a fire that nearly claimed her life when she was barely 3 years old. The morning routine had become a ritual of concealment. Maya's fingers moved with practiced precision as she applied layers of concealer, foundation, and powder, each product carefully chosen after years of trial and error. The makeup created a mask of normalcy, but it could never fully hide what lay beneath. In certain lighting, under the scrutiny of curious eyes, the scar would emerge like a ghost through the cosmetic veil, betraying her attempts at invisibility. The hallways of Jefferson High School stretched before her like a gauntlet of judgment. Maya's shoulders hunched forward instinctively, her long auburn hair falling like a curtain across the right side of her face. She had perfected the art of walking with her head tilted just so, creating a natural shield against the stares that followed her wherever she went. The whispers were always there, floating just beyond her hearing, fragments of conversations that she knew centered on her disfigurement. During lunch period, Maya sought refuge in the library's far corner, where dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight filtering through tall windows. She would sit alone, picking at a sandwich she rarely finished, her eyes fixed on pages of books that served as barriers between herself and the world. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, had long ago stopped asking if she needed help, recognizing in Maya's posture the universal language of someone who wished to remain invisible. The worst moments came during group activities in chemistry class, when Mr. Patterson would assign partners and Maya would watch as eyes darted away from hers, students suddenly finding their notebooks fascinating as they hoped to avoid being paired with the girl with the scar. The silence that followed her name being called felt like a physical weight, crushing down on her chest until breathing became an effort of will. At home, the Jensen household maintained an atmosphere of protective normalcy. Robert Jensen, a soft-spoken man with graying temples and kind eyes, would glance up from his evening newspaper whenever Maya entered the room, his expression immediately shifting to one of careful concern. Helen Jensen moved through their modest suburban home like a guardian angel, anticipating her daughter's needs before they were voiced, preparing Maya's favorite meals, and ensuring that family photographs were strategically angled to show Maya's unmarked profile. The decision to seek treatment had been brewing for months, whispered conversations between her parents that ended abruptly whenever Maya appeared. It was Helen who finally broached the subject one evening, as they sat around the dinner table, the autumn rain pattering against the kitchen windows. The words came carefully measured, as if she had rehearsed them many times. A specialist in the city, Dr. Alistair Finch, had been recommended by their family physician. Laser treatment, she explained, could significantly reduce the appearance of old burn scars. The possibility hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. Maya's heart had hammered against her ribs as she absorbed the information. Hope was a dangerous emotion for someone who had learned to expect disappointment, but it bloomed in her chest despite her attempts to remain cautious. That night, she had stood before her bedroom mirror for what felt like hours, imagining a face unmarked by tragedy, picturing herself walking through school hallways with her head held high, making eye contact without flinching. The weeks leading up to the consultation passed in a haze of anticipation and research. Maya spent countless hours on her laptop, reading testimonials and studying before and after photographs of laser scar treatment. She memorized statistics about success rates and absorbed every piece of information she could find about the procedure. Her parents watched with a mixture of hope and apprehension as their daughter displayed more energy and engagement than she had shown in years. The morning of the appointment arrived crisp and clear, with October sunlight slanting through bare tree branches. Maya had chosen her outfit carefully. A soft blue sweater that complemented her eyes and made her skin appear less pale, dark jeans that made her feel confident, and her lucky earrings, small silver stars that her grandmother had given her for her 13th birthday. She had applied her makeup with extra care, though the irony was not lost on her that she was covering her scar before visiting a doctor who specialized in removing it. Dr. Finch's office occupied the top floor of a sleek medical building in the city's professional district. The waiting room was decorated in soothing earth tones, with abstract artwork adorning the walls and classical music playing softly from hidden speakers. Maya sat between her parents on a plush sofa, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching other patients who had come seeking their own versions of transformation. When her name was called, Maya's legs felt unsteady as she rose to follow the nurse down a corridor lined with diplomas and certificates. The examination room was bright and sterile, dominated by a leather chair surrounded by sophisticated medical equipment. Dr. Alistair Finch entered moments later, a tall man in his early 50s with silver-streaked dark hair and intelligent gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His initial examination was gentle but thorough, his questions delivered in a voice that was both professional and kind. Maya found herself relaxing slightly as he explained the laser treatment process, his words painting a picture of gradual improvement over several months. Her parents nodded along, Helen occasionally reaching over to squeeze Maya's hand encouragingly. But then Dr. Finch leaned closer, adjusting the bright examination lamp to cast direct light across Maya's scar. His expression, which had been warmly professional moments before, began to shift almost imperceptibly. His brow furrowed slightly as he traced the air just above the damaged tissue, never quite touching but clearly studying every detail of the wound's pattern. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Dr. Finch continued his examination, his gray eyes moving with scientific precision across the landscape of Maya's damaged skin. Maya could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, could feel the weight of her parents' attention as they watched the doctor's face for any sign of his assessment. When Dr. Finch finally leaned back, the expression on his face was no longer one of routine medical evaluation. There was something deeper there now, a flicker of confusion that he tried to mask behind professional composure. His eyes met Maya's briefly before shifting to her parents, and in that moment, the first crack appeared in the foundation of everything Maya had believed about herself. The hope that had sustained her through weeks of anticipation began to waver as she registered the subtle change in the room's atmosphere. Something was wrong, though she couldn't yet comprehend what it might be. All she knew was that the man who was supposed to offer her salvation was looking at her scar not with the confident assessment of a healer, but with the puzzled concern of someone who had discovered something that didn't quite fit the story he had been told. The examination room felt smaller suddenly, the air thick with intention that Maya couldn't name. Dr. Finch had withdrawn his hands from near her face and was now studying her scar with the intensity of someone reading a map written in a foreign language. The bright medical lamp continued to cast its harsh white light across her skin, making every ridge and valley of the damaged tissue visible in stark detail. Maya could feel her pulse quickening, a flutter of anxiety beginning to build in her chest as the doctor's silence stretched beyond what felt normal. Dr. Finch's gray eyes moved methodically across the scar's surface, his professional mask slipping slightly to reveal something that looked uncomfortably like concern. His fingers hovered millimeters above her skin, tracing invisible lines that seemed to tell him a story different from the one he had been expecting to read. The furrow between his brows deepened, and Maya noticed the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, as if he were fighting an internal battle about whether to voice what he was thinking. Behind her, Maya could sense her parents shifting in their chairs. Robert's newspaper had long since been forgotten in his lap, and she could feel Helen's watchful gaze boring into the back of her head. The classical music from the waiting room seemed to have faded, leaving only the soft hum of medical equipment and the sound of her own increasingly rapid breathing to fill the uncomfortable silence. When Dr. Finch finally spoke, his words fell into the room like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would eventually become waves. His voice was measured, careful, but there was an undercurrent of professional obligation that made his concerns impossible to dismiss. The scar pattern, he explained, was inconsistent with typical burn injuries from house fires. The edges were too clean in some places, too jagged in others. The depth variation suggested a different type of trauma altogether. Maya's world seemed to tilt on its axis as the doctor's words penetrated her consciousness. The medical terminology washed over her in fragments: blunt force trauma, impact patterns, inconsistent healing markers, each phrase chipping away at the foundation of everything she had believed about herself. Her hands began to tremble in her lap, fingers twisting together as she tried to process what she was hearing. The doctor's explanation continued with clinical precision. Burn scars, he noted, typically showed evidence of thermal damage extending beyond the primary wound site. They often presented with a characteristic texture and coloration that developed from tissue death caused by extreme heat. What he was observing on Maya's face told a different story entirely. The scar's characteristics were more consistent with what he might expect to see from a severe impact injury, perhaps from a fall onto a hard surface or contact with a sharp edge during a violent motion. Maya's breathing became shallow as the implications of his words began to sink in. Every story her parents had told her about that terrible night 15 years ago suddenly seemed to shimmer with uncertainty. The heroic tale of her father risking his life to pull her from the burning nursery, the dramatic race to the hospital, the weeks of touch-and-go recovery that had become family legend. All of it now hung in the balance of one doctor's professional observation. Behind her, she heard Robert clear his throat, the sound sharp and defensive in the sterile air of the examination room. Helen's chair creaked as she leaned forward, and Maya could sense the sudden alertness in both her parents, like animals who had caught the scent of a predator on the wind. The warmth and supportive energy that had filled the room during the early part of the consultation evaporated, replaced by something colder and more guarded. Robert's voice, when it came, carried a forced lightness that didn't quite mask an underlying edge of irritation. He reminded Dr. Finch that the original medical team had been working under emergency conditions, dealing with a critically injured 3-year-old in the chaos of a trauma situation. Mistakes in documentation were certainly possible, he suggested, his tone implying that the current observation was simply another such error. Medical records from that time, he added with what seemed like rehearsed casualness, had been damaged in a clerical flood years later, making verification of the original diagnosis impossible. Helen's contribution came in the form of motherly concern mixed with gentle dismissal. Her voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child. Maya had been so young when the accident happened, she pointed out, and the emotional trauma had been as severe as the physical damage. It was entirely possible that the original treating physicians had used simplified terminology when discussing the injury with the family, focusing more on treatment than on precise diagnostic categories. Maya found herself caught between two competing realities. On one side stood Dr. Finch, a respected specialist whose reputation had brought them to this office, whose scientific training and years of experience lent weight to his observations. On the other side were her parents, the two people who had loved and protected her throughout her entire life, who had no reason to lie about something so fundamental to her identity. The teenager's mind raced as she tried to reconcile these conflicting narratives. She thought about all the times she had asked for details about that night, how her parents' answers had always seemed slightly vague, focusing more on their emotional responses than on specific facts. She remembered the way they sometimes exchanged quick glances when the topic came up, how conversations about her early childhood often shifted direction when she pressed for more information. Dr. Finch seemed to sense the turmoil his observation had created. His expression softened as he looked at Maya, and she could see him weighing his professional obligations against the obvious distress his words had caused. He spoke more gently now, emphasizing that his concerns were based on visual examination alone, that scar tissue could be unpredictable in its formation and appearance. Without access to the original medical records and photographs from the time of the injury, he acknowledged, definitive conclusions were impossible to draw. But despite his diplomatic backtracking, the seed of doubt had been planted. Maya could feel it taking root in the fertile ground of years of unanswered questions and half-remembered inconsistencies. The confidence she had felt walking into this office, the bright hope for a future free from her disfigurement, now seemed naive and fragile in the harsh light of medical scrutiny. Her parents moved swiftly to repair the damage to their carefully constructed narrative. They spoke in overlapping sentences about moving forward with the treatment plan, about not letting ancient medical uncertainties derail Maya's chance for improvement. Helen reached over to squeeze her daughter's hand, the gesture both comforting and possessive, while Robert began discussing scheduling and insurance coverage with determined optimism. Yet Maya found herself studying her parents' faces with new eyes, searching for signs of deception in expressions she had trusted implicitly her entire life. The way Robert's smile didn't quite reach his eyes, how Helen's reassurances came perhaps too quickly and with too much force. These tiny details, which she might have overlooked before, now seemed pregnant with significance. As the consultation wound toward its conclusion, Maya felt as though she were standing at the edge of a precipice she had never known existed. Behind her lay the comfortable certainty of her life's narrative, the story that had shaped her identity and explained her suffering. Ahead stretched an unknown territory of questions and possibilities that terrified her even as they called to her with the promise of truth. The first crack had appeared in the foundation of her world, and Maya sensed with growing certainty that once the questioning began, there would be no way to stop the inevitable collapse of everything she thought she knew about herself. The days following the consultation with Dr. Finch blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights and distracted thoughts. Maya found herself unable to concentrate on anything for more than a few minutes at a time. During classes, her mind would wander from algebra equations to the memory of the doctor's furrowed brow, from English literature discussions to the careful way her parents had deflected his concerns. Every family dinner became an exercise in observation, Maya studying her parents' faces for tells she had never noticed before, searching for cracks in their familiar expressions. The doubt that had taken root in Dr. Finch's office grew stronger with each passing hour. Maya began to notice things that had previously seemed insignificant. The way conversations about her early childhood always seemed to hit invisible walls, how certain photo albums were kept in places she couldn't easily reach, the subtle tension that would creep into her mother's voice whenever Maya asked too many questions about that night 12 years ago. These observations accumulated like sediment, creating a foundation of suspicion that she couldn't ignore. It was during a particularly sleepless Tuesday night that Maya remembered her grandmother's basement. Eleanor Jensen had passed away 2 years prior, and her small Victorian house had been sitting mostly empty since then, visited only occasionally by Robert for maintenance and Helen for the removal of specific items they deemed worth keeping. Maya recalled summer afternoons spent in that basement as a young child, playing among cardboard boxes filled with decades of accumulated memories while her grandmother did laundry or tended to household tasks upstairs. The memory that surfaced with startling clarity was of a particular wooden crate tucked away in the basement's far corner, filled with photo albums, documents, and miscellaneous family memorabilia that predated Maya's birth. She remembered her grandmother mentioning that the box contained items from Maya's early years, things that Helen had asked to store there for safekeeping. At the time, Maya had been too young to understand why certain photographs and keepsakes weren't displayed in their own home, like other family memories. The decision to investigate came not as a dramatic revelation, but as a gradual crystallization of need. Maya knew she couldn't continue living with the questions that Dr. Finch had inadvertently planted without seeking some form of resolution. The key to her grandmother's house still hung on a hook in their kitchen, where Robert had left it after his last maintenance visit. On Thursday afternoon, while her parents were both at work, Maya made her choice. The October air was crisp as she walked the 6 blocks to her grandmother's neighborhood, fallen leaves crunching beneath her sneakers with each step. The Victorian house stood exactly as she remembered it, with its faded blue shutters and overgrown garden. But there was something melancholy about its emptiness that hadn't been there during her grandmother's lifetime. The key turned easily in the front door, and Maya stepped into the familiar scent of old wood, lavender sachets, and the lingering traces of her grandmother's perfume. The basement stairs creaked with each downward step, the sound echoing in the confined space. Maya had to fumble for several moments before locating the pull chain that activated the single bare bulb overhead. The light revealed exactly what she remembered. A maze of cardboard boxes, old furniture draped in sheets, and household items that had been relegated to storage. The air was cooler down here, carrying the musty smell of concrete and aged paper. The wooden crate sat exactly where she remembered it, pushed against the far wall behind a stack of her grandmother's old gardening magazines. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the heavy lid, revealing layers of carefully preserved memories. The top layer consisted of her grandmother's own photograph albums, filled with black and white images of relatives Maya had never met, and places she had never been. But beneath these lay what she was looking for. A smaller album bound in faded pink leather, with Maya's name written in her grandmother's careful script across the cover. Maya settled cross-legged on the cold concrete floor, the album heavy in her lap. The pages revealed a chronological journey through her early years, starting with hospital photographs that must have been taken shortly after her birth. Her infant self looked impossibly small and fragile, swaddled in white blankets with a tiny knitted cap covering most of her head. But it was the third photograph that made her breath catch in her throat. The image showed Maya at what must have been around 2 years old, sitting in a high chair with a wide, toothless grin. Her hair was still thin and wispy, and her cheeks were round with baby fat. But there, clearly visible on her left temple, was a small birthmark in the unmistakable shape of a 5-pointed star. Maya stared at the photograph with growing unease, her memory providing no recollection of ever having such a distinctive marking. In every photograph she had ever seen of herself at home, her face was either turned away from the camera or positioned so that her left temple wasn't visible. Her hands moved more frantically now through the album, searching for other images that might show the birthmark more clearly. She found several, each one confirming what the first had revealed. The star-shaped mark was prominent and distinctive, a deep brownish color that would have been impossible to miss or forget. Yet Maya had no memory of her parents ever mentioning it, no recollection of it being removed or treated, no explanation for why it had simply vanished from her family's photographic record. At the bottom of the crate, beneath layers of documents and miscellaneous papers, Maya's searching fingers encountered something that felt different from the rest. It was a manila envelope, yellowed with age and brittle to the touch. Her grandmother's handwriting across the front identified it as containing newspaper clippings from Maya's birth year, though the specific contents weren't specified. Maya opened the envelope with careful reverence, aware that whatever lay inside had been deemed important enough by her grandmother to preserve for over a decade. The first few clippings were routine birth announcements and local news items from the summer Maya was born. But halfway through the small stack, her fingers encountered a larger piece of newsprint that had been carefully folded to preserve its contents. The headline seemed to leap off the page as Maya unfolded the clipping. 3-year-old girl kidnapped from local daycare. The date stamp showed it was from exactly 12 years ago, placing the incident at precisely the time her parents claimed she had been injured in the house fire. Maya's vision seemed to narrow as she read the details, each sentence hitting her with the force of a physical blow. The article described the disappearance of Lila Monroe, the 3-year-old daughter of prominent local businessman Marcus Monroe and his wife Catherine. The child had vanished during what appeared to be a carefully planned abduction from the Sunshine Children's Center during the afternoon nap period. The most chilling detail, however, came in the physical description provided by the grief-stricken parents. Lila had distinctive blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and a prominent star-shaped birthmark on her left temple. Maya's hands began to shake so violently that the newspaper clipping rustled audibly in the basement silence. She looked down at the photograph in her other hand, at the image of herself as a toddler with that unmistakable star-shaped birthmark, then back at the description of the kidnapped child. The similarities weren't coincidental or approximate. They were exact, down to details so specific that no other explanation seemed possible. The basement seemed to close in around her as the full implications of her discovery settled into her consciousness. The story of the house fire, the tragic accident that had scarred her face and shaped her entire identity, began to crumble like ancient paper exposed to air. In its place rose a far more sinister possibility, that Maya Jensen was not who she believed herself to be, that the people she called her parents might be responsible for one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. Maya's breathing became rapid and shallow as panic began to set in. She stared at the 2 pieces of evidence in her hands, the photograph and the newspaper clipping, as they seemed to pulse with terrible significance. The child in the photo and the missing girl described in the article were unmistakably the same person. The birthmark that had mysteriously vanished from her family's official photographic record was the same distinctive marking that had been seared into the memories of 2 devastated parents searching for their stolen daughter. The concrete floor felt cold against her legs as Maya remained frozen in place, unable to process the enormity of what she had uncovered. Every memory of her childhood now seemed tainted with deception, every moment of parental love clouded by the possibility that it had been built on the foundation of an unthinkable crime. The scar on her face, which had caused her so much anguish throughout her life, suddenly seemed like the least significant aspect of her identity, compared to the question of who she really was and how she had come to be living the life of Maya Jensen, rather than that of Lila Monroe. The silence of the empty house pressed down on her as she sat surrounded by the detritus of 3 generations of family history, holding in her trembling hands the evidence that would shatter everything she had ever believed about herself and the people who had raised her. Maya sat in her car outside her grandmother's house for nearly an hour after making her devastating discovery, her hands still clutching the newspaper clipping and photograph that had upended her entire world. The autumn evening was settling into twilight, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed mockingly beautiful against the darkness that had descended over her life. Her reflection in the rearview mirror showed a face she no longer recognized as her own. Not Maya Jensen, but possibly Lila Monroe, a stolen child whose real parents had spent 12 years searching for her. The drive home passed in a blur of familiar streets that now seemed alien and threatening. Every landmark of her childhood took on sinister new meaning. The park where Robert had taught her to ride a bike, the ice cream shop where Helen had celebrated her good grades, the elementary school where she had taken her first tentative steps into the world. All of it built on a foundation of lies so profound that Maya felt as though she were seeing her entire life through someone else's eyes. The Jensen house looked exactly as it always had when Maya pulled into the driveway, modest, well-maintained, with Helen's carefully tended flower boxes and Robert's weekend yard work evident in every detail. But now the normalcy felt like a carefully constructed facade, a stage set designed to hide the unthinkable truth of what lay beneath. Maya's hands shook as she gathered the evidence from the passenger seat, the newspaper clipping and photograph feeling heavier than their physical weight should have allowed. Inside, the sounds of domestic routine created a surreal contrast to the chaos raging in Maya's mind. She could hear Robert's evening news program playing in the living room, Helen's footsteps moving around the kitchen as she prepared dinner, the familiar clink of dishes being set on the table. These sounds, which had represented safety and home for her entire conscious life, now seemed to mock the innocence she had lost in her grandmother's basement. Maya stood in the front hallway for several minutes, gathering the courage for what she was about to do. Her reflection in the hall mirror showed a face pale with shock and fear, her scar seeming more prominent than usual against her bloodless skin. She thought about the countless times she had hated that mark, wished it away, blamed it for her isolation and pain. Now she understood it might be the only honest thing about her entire identity, a genuine wound sustained during genuine trauma, even if everything she had been told about its origin was a lie. When she finally entered the living room, Robert looked up from his newspaper with the same mild, loving expression he had worn her entire life. Helen emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her face brightening at the sight of her daughter. For a moment, Maya almost lost her resolve. These people had loved her, cared for her, sacrificed for her. The tenderness in their faces seemed so genuine that her newfound suspicions felt like a betrayal of their devotion. But then Maya's fingers tightened around the evidence in her hands, and she remembered the photograph of a missing child with a star-shaped birthmark, the desperate parents who had never stopped searching for their stolen daughter. She placed the newspaper clipping and the baby photograph side by side on the coffee table between herself and the people she had called her parents for 15 years. The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate and profound. Robert's newspaper crumpled in his suddenly nerveless fingers, his face draining of color as his eyes focused on the damning evidence before him. Helen's cheerful expression froze, then slowly crumbled into something Maya had never seen before, naked terror mixed with desperate calculation. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing, heavy with the weight of secrets that could no longer be hidden. Maya watched as her parents exchanged a look that spoke volumes, a communication born of years spent protecting a terrible secret. She saw Robert's almost imperceptible nod, Helen's minute shake of her head, the way they both seemed to age a decade in the space of a few seconds. Their faces became maps of guilt and fear, showing her a side of them she had never suspected existed. Robert was the first to attempt damage control, his voice carrying a forced steadiness that didn't match the panic in his eyes. He suggested that the newspaper clipping was simply a tragic coincidence, that missing children were unfortunately common, that the physical similarities Maya thought she saw were the product of her imagination, influenced by Dr. Finch's misguided observations. His explanations came too quickly, overlapping and contradicting each other in ways that only served to confirm Maya's worst fears. Helen's approach was more emotional, her maternal instincts kicking in even as her carefully constructed world began to collapse around her. She reached for Maya with trembling hands, her voice breaking as she insisted that whatever Maya thought she had discovered, nothing could change the love they had shared, the family they had built together. But even as she spoke, Maya could see the guilt written in every line of her face, the knowledge that her words were hollow attempts to maintain a lie that had already been exposed. The denials became increasingly frantic as Maya remained silent, her steady gaze moving between the evidence on the table and the faces of the people she had trusted absolutely. She could see them realizing that their usual tactics of deflection and distraction would not work this time, that the truth they had spent over a decade hiding was finally demanding acknowledgement. It was Robert who finally broke under the pressure, his composure cracking like a dam that had reached its structural limit. The confession came not as a planned revelation, but as an explosion of suppressed guilt and fear. His words tumbled out in a torrent of desperate honesty, each sentence hitting Maya like a physical blow. He spoke of financial desperation that had driven them to accept work they knew was wrong, of being hired as drivers for people whose business they preferred not to examine too closely. He described the day they were asked to transport a child from a daycare center to a specified location, the way they had told themselves they were just following orders, that they weren't really part of whatever larger plan was unfolding. The details of that terrible day poured out of Robert like poison from an infected wound. Maya learned of the moment they had seen her, Lila, in the daycare center, a bright, trusting 3-year-old who had gone willingly with the adults who claimed they were taking her to see her parents. She heard about the planned handoff that had gone wrong, the police sirens that had sent them fleeing in panic, the accident during their desperate escape that had sent her small body crashing into the car's interior and carved the scar that would mark her face forever. But perhaps the most devastating revelation was what came next, the decision that had sealed all their fates. Robert's voice broke as he described the moment they had stopped running, looked at the injured child in their back seat, and made the choice that would define the rest of their lives. They could have taken her to a hospital, could have called the police, could have tried to undo the terrible thing they had participated in. Instead, they had seen in her something that called to their deepest longings, the child they had never been able to have, the family they had always dreamed of building. Helen's sobs provided a heartbreaking counterpoint to Robert's confession, her body shaking with the force of emotions she had suppressed for over a decade. Maya watched this woman who had been her mother in every way that mattered dissolve into grief and guilt, and felt her own heart breaking even as her world crumbled around her. The room filled with the weight of Robert's words as he described the months that followed, the careful construction of new identities, the creation of a plausible backstory about a house fire, the gradual transformation of Lila Monroe into Maya Jensen. He spoke of sleepless nights spent watching for police cars, of the constant fear that their deception would be discovered, of the way that fear had gradually been replaced by genuine love for the child they had stolen. Maya felt as though she were drowning in the revelation, each new detail dragging her further from the surface of everything she had believed about herself. The people sitting across from her were no longer her parents, but criminals who had built their happiness on the foundation of another family's devastation. Yet they were also the people who had kissed her goodnight every evening, who had celebrated her achievements and comforted her failures, who had loved her with a devotion that seemed impossible to fake. The confession reached its climax as Robert admitted the full scope of their crime. Not just the kidnapping, but the years of deception that had followed, the way they had systematically erased every trace of Lila Monroe's existence while building the fiction of Maya Jensen's life. Maya understood now why certain photographs had been hidden, why questions about her early childhood had always met with vague answers, why her parents had seemed so protective of their family's privacy. As Robert's voice finally trailed into silence, the three of them sat surrounded by the wreckage of 15 years of carefully constructed lies. Maya found herself staring at these people who had shaped her entire existence, seeing them clearly for the first time. Not as the loving parents she had always known, but as desperate criminals who had stolen a child and convinced themselves that love could justify the theft. The evidence on the coffee table seemed to pulse with terrible significance, the newspaper clipping and photograph serving as silent witnesses to a truth that could no longer be denied. Maya felt the last vestiges of her old identity crumbling away, leaving behind only questions about who she really was and what she was supposed to do with the devastating knowledge that had just been laid before her. The silence that followed Robert's confession lasted only seconds before it shattered into chaos. Maya watched in stunned disbelief as the people she had known as her parents transformed before her eyes, their faces hardening into expressions of desperate calculation. Robert's hands shook as he ran them through his graying hair, while Helen paced the length of the living room like a caged animal, her earlier tears replaced by a manic energy that made Maya's blood run cold. The transformation was swift and terrifying. Robert began barking orders about packing essentials, about the emergency funds they had kept hidden for years, about routes and timing and contingency plans that revealed just how much thought they had given to this possibility. Helen disappeared upstairs, her footsteps heavy and frantic as she moved between rooms, gathering items with the efficiency of someone who had mentally rehearsed this scenario countless times. Maya remained frozen on the couch, her mind struggling to process the surreal turn her life had taken. Less than an hour ago, she had been their beloved daughter coming home from school. Now she was apparently a kidnapping victim, whose captors were preparing to flee the country to avoid prosecution. The newspaper clipping and photograph still lay on the coffee table, but they seemed almost irrelevant now compared to the immediate danger she found herself facing. When Robert grabbed her arm with surprising strength, Maya felt the last vestiges of her childhood innocence evaporate. His grip was firm and unyielding, his eyes carrying a desperation she had never seen before. The man who had taught her to ride a bicycle, who had attended every school play and parent-teacher conference, was now forcing her toward the front door with the determined efficiency of someone who had crossed a line from which there was no return. Maya's attempts to resist were futile against Robert's adrenaline-fueled strength. She tried to dig her heels into the carpet, to grab onto furniture, to make herself as difficult to move as possible, but he simply overpowered her with the single-minded focus of a man who saw his entire world collapsing around him. Helen reappeared with a hastily packed suitcase and Maya's own school backpack, into which she had apparently thrown random items of Maya's clothing and personal effects. The garage felt like a tomb as Robert forced Maya toward their aging sedan, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows that made everything appear distorted and nightmarish. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized that once they left this house, she might never see freedom again. These people who had claimed to love her were now treating her as cargo to be transported, evidence to be hidden, a problem to be solved rather than a person with rights and choices of her own. Helen's face was a mask of conflicted emotion as she helped Robert maneuver Maya into the back seat of the car. Maya could see traces of the woman who had comforted her through nightmares and celebrated her small victories, but that person now seemed buried beneath layers of panic and guilt. Helen's hands trembled as she fastened Maya's seatbelt with unnecessary force, her maternal instincts warring with her criminal ones in ways that were both heartbreaking and terrifying to witness. The car engine turned over with a reluctant wheeze, and Maya felt a surge of desperate hope that the aging vehicle might refuse to start, buying her precious time for someone to discover what was happening. But Robert's mechanical skills, honed by years of maintaining their modest household, coaxed the engine to life, and soon they were backing out of the driveway that had been the gateway to Maya's entire conscious existence. As they pulled onto the street, Maya pressed her face against the rear window, watching her childhood home recede into the darkness. Every familiar landmark they passed felt like another link in the chain that had once connected her to a life that now seemed as fictional as a movie she had once enjoyed. The elementary school where she had learned to read, the corner store where Helen had bought her candy as a special treat, the houses of neighbors who had watched her grow up. All of it fell behind them, like pieces of a puzzle being scattered to the wind. Meanwhile, across town in the Finch household, Noah Finch found himself unable to concentrate on his homework. The teenager had been present in his father's office during Maya's consultation, ostensibly helping with filing, but actually listening to the medical discussion with the curiosity of someone considering his own future in medicine. Dr. Finch's observations about Maya's scar had stuck in Noah's mind, particularly the obvious discomfort they had caused her parents. Noah had spent the days following the consultation, researching burn injuries and scar patterns, driven by the same analytical mind that had made him an exceptional student. What he discovered in his research only deepened his concerns about Maya's case. The patterns his father had described were indeed inconsistent with typical fire-related injuries, and the more Noah learned about trauma medicine, the more convinced he became that Maya's parents were hiding something significant about her medical history. The 17-year-old's investigation took on a more urgent tone when he began researching missing children cases from the relevant time period. Working late into the evening on his laptop, Noah systematically searched through archives of local newspaper reports, missing persons databases, and law enforcement bulletins from 12 years prior. His methodical approach, inherited from his physician father, led him to the same newspaper article that Maya had discovered in her grandmother's basement. The photograph of 3-year-old Lila Monroe hit Noah like a physical blow. Even allowing for the changes that 12 years could bring to a person's appearance, the resemblance to Maya Jensen was unmistakable. The star-shaped birthmark mentioned in the article provided a detail so specific that coincidence seemed impossible, and Noah found himself staring at his computer screen with growing horror as the implications of his discovery became clear. Noah's hands shook as he reached for his phone to call his father. But something made him hesitate. The accusations he was preparing to make were so serious that he wanted to be absolutely certain of his facts before involving law enforcement. Instead, he made a different choice, one that would prove to be life-saving for Maya. Using skills he had learned in his computer science classes, Noah began tracking the digital footprints of Robert and Helen Jensen. Social media accounts, credit card transactions, cell phone records. He followed every electronic trail he could access, looking for patterns that might confirm his suspicions. What he found was a couple who had lived remarkably quiet, private lives, with very few digital traces prior to Maya's 3rd birthday, and an almost obsessive avoidance of social media and public records since then. But it was the cell phone activity from the past hour that sent Noah into action. The tracking software he had installed on his laptop, originally intended for a school project about digital privacy, showed Robert Jensen's phone moving away from their neighborhood at highway speeds. Helen's phone was traveling the same route, and the direction they were heading was toward the interstate highways that led to international borders. Noah's call to his father was brief and urgent, his words tumbling over each other as he explained his research and his growing certainty that Maya Jensen was actually Lila Monroe. Dr. Finch listened with the same analytical mind that made him an excellent surgeon, asking pointed questions about Noah's evidence while simultaneously reaching for his own phone to contact the authorities. The police response was swift and coordinated, aided by Noah's real-time tracking of the Jensen family's location. Multiple patrol units were dispatched to intercept their vehicle, while detectives began the process of verifying Noah's research and preparing for what could be one of the most significant kidnapping cases in the region's recent history. Inside the fleeing sedan, Maya had discovered that the door handles had been disabled from the inside, trapping her in the back seat like a prisoner. Her attempts to attract attention from other drivers were hampered by the tinted windows and the late evening darkness, and she found herself fighting against a rising tide of panic as she realized how completely powerless she had become. Robert drove with grim determination, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror for signs of pursuit, while Helen navigated using a GPS device set for a border crossing hundreds of miles away. The car's headlights carved tunnels of light through the darkness ahead, each mile taking them further from everything Maya had ever known and closer to a future that filled her with dread. It was Helen who first spotted the flashing lights in the distance, her sharp intake of breath alerting Robert to the approaching danger. Maya turned to look through the rear window and felt her heart leap with desperate hope as she saw the unmistakable pattern of police emergency lights growing larger against the night sky. The vehicles were still far behind them, but they were gaining ground with the superior speed and power of law enforcement interceptors. Maya pressed her face against the glass, tears streaming down her cheeks as she realized that someone had discovered what was happening to her, that her disappearance had not gone unnoticed, that help was finally coming. The lights grew brighter and more numerous as additional police units joined the pursuit, their synchronized flashing creating a constellation of hope in the darkness behind them. The police intercept happened with the sudden violence of a storm breaking. Maya felt the sedan lurch as Robert swerved desperately across multiple lanes of highway, the tires screaming against asphalt as he tried to evade the tightening circle of patrol cars. The night exploded into chaos, flashing red and blue lights painting the interior of the car in nauseating strobes. the deafening wail of sirens drowning out Helen's panicked sobs, and the harsh metallic voice of police loudspeakers demanding surrender cutting through the din. When the car finally skidded to a stop on the shoulder of the highway, Maya felt as though she were watching someone else's life unfold through a window. The doors were yanked open by officers in tactical gear, their faces grim behind protective visors, their movements precise and professional. Robert and Helen were pulled from the front seats with practiced efficiency, their hands secured behind their backs with plastic restraints while they were read their rights in voices devoid of sympathy. Maya found herself treated with the careful gentleness reserved for victims rather than suspects. A female officer with kind eyes and steady hands helped her from the back seat, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders despite the mild evening temperature. The gesture felt surreal after the terror of the past hours. This stranger showing her more genuine care than the people who had claimed to be her parents as they dragged her toward an uncertain fate. The ride to the police station passed in a blur of radio chatter and concerned questions from the officers. Maya sat in the back of a patrol car that smelled of coffee and worn vinyl, watching the familiar landscape of her hometown scroll past the windows. Everything looked different now, as though she were seeing it through new eyes, the eyes of someone who was no longer Maya Jensen, but not yet comfortable being Lila Monroe. The police station felt like a fortress of fluorescent lights and institutional carpet, filled with the constant hum of activity that never ceased regardless of the hour. Maya was escorted to a small room furnished with a few chairs and a low table, where a victim's advocate with gentle mannerisms and a soft voice explained what would happen next. The woman spoke about medical examinations, interviews with social workers, and the complex legal process of establishing Maya's true identity. But the words seemed to float around Maya without quite penetrating her consciousness. It was during this surreal interlude that Dr. Finch arrived, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of the stress and urgency that had driven him to the station at such a late hour. Maya felt a complicated mix of emotions at seeing him again. Gratitude for his role in uncovering the truth, confusion about his unexpected presence, and a lingering wariness born of too many recent revelations about the people she had trusted. But Dr. Finch was not alone. Behind him stood a woman who appeared to be in her early 40s, with prematurely silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, and eyes that were unmistakably the same shade of blue as Maya's own. Eleanor Vance carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and respect. But there was something fragile beneath her composed exterior, a tension that suggested years of carefully controlled hope and disappointment. Maya studied this stranger's face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle, searching for familiar features in a countenance she had never seen before. The woman's nose had the same slight upturn that Maya saw in her own reflection, and there was something about the shape of her mouth that seemed to echo in Maya's own features. But it was the way Eleanor's eyes filled with tears upon seeing Maya that provided the first real evidence of their connection. Dr. Finch's explanation came slowly, carefully, as though he were aware of the weight each word would carry for the traumatized teenager before him. Eleanor Vance was his older sister, he revealed, and she had been living with the nightmare of Lila's disappearance for 12 agonizing years. The successful businesswoman who had built a telecommunications empire had never allowed her professional achievements to overshadow her primary mission, finding her stolen daughter. Maya learned that Eleanor had divorced her husband, Marcus Monroe, within 2 years of the kidnapping, unable to reconcile their different approaches to grief and the investigation. While Marcus had eventually accepted the possibility that their daughter might never be found, Eleanor had refused to abandon hope. She had hired private investigators, maintained relationships with law enforcement agencies, and funded missing children organizations, all while building a fortune that could support an indefinite search for her lost child. The revelation that Dr. Finch was her uncle sent Maya reeling once again. The man who had first questioned the story of her scar, who had inadvertently set in motion the discovery of her true identity, was not a stranger at all, but a member of her biological family who had been unknowingly treating his own niece. The cosmic irony of the situation was almost too much for Maya to process. That fate had brought them together in the most mundane of circumstances, a routine medical consultation that had changed everything. Dr. Finch explained that he had contacted Eleanor immediately after Noah's research had confirmed their suspicions about Maya's identity. Eleanor had been in Seattle on business when the call came, but she had chartered a private jet and flown through the night to reach the police station. The woman had spent the flight reviewing every photograph and document related to her daughter's case, preparing herself for what might be either the greatest joy or the most crushing disappointment of her life. Maya found herself studying Eleanor's face for signs of recognition that went both ways. Did this woman see in Maya's features the child she had lost 12 years ago? Could a mother's love survive such a long separation, such fundamental changes in the person her daughter had become? Eleanor seemed to be conducting the same silent examination, her eyes moving across Maya's face with the desperate hunger of someone who had been denied even a photograph of her child's growth and development. The star-shaped birthmark that had caused Maya so much anguish throughout her adolescence suddenly took on profound new meaning. Eleanor reached into her purse with trembling hands and withdrew a small leather photo album, its pages worn soft by years of handling. The images it contained showed a happy family, a younger Eleanor and her then-husband Marcus with their bright-eyed toddler, Lila. In every photograph, the star-shaped birthmark on the child's temple was clearly visible, a distinctive feature that had been seared into Eleanor's memory as the surest way to identify her daughter if she were ever found. Maya touched her own temple instinctively, tracing the outline of the birthmark that had always made her feel different and marked. She had covered it with makeup for years, had wished desperately that it would fade or disappear entirely. Now she understood that it had been a beacon, a sign that had led her family to find her despite the years and the lies and the carefully constructed false identity that had hidden her from them. Eleanor's composure finally cracked as she looked at these old photographs alongside the living, breathing teenager who sat before her. Tears streamed down her face as she spoke about the hole that Lila's disappearance had left in her life, about the birthdays celebrated alone, about the Christmas presents that had accumulated unopened in a room she had maintained as a shrine to her missing daughter. She described the false leads and dead ends that had marked the investigation, the moments of hope followed by crushing disappointment, the way she had forced herself to imagine her daughter growing up somewhere else, becoming someone else, but never stopping her search. Maya felt overwhelmed by the weight of this woman's devotion, by the realization that she had been loved and searched for even when she hadn't known she was missing. The life she had lived as Maya Jensen suddenly seemed like a shadow existence, a pale imitation of the rich and complex identity that had been stolen from her. Eleanor Vance was not just a successful businesswoman, but a mother who had refused to give up, who had channeled her grief and determination into a 12-year quest that had finally reached its conclusion. The police station's harsh fluorescent lighting seemed to soften as Maya began to process the magnitude of what was happening to her. She was not just learning about her true identity. She was discovering that she had never been truly alone, that someone had been looking for her every day since her disappearance. The scar on her face, which had defined so much of her self-image, was suddenly revealed to be the least significant aspect of her story. She was Lila Monroe, the daughter of Eleanor Vance, the niece of Dr. Finch, a member of a family that had never stopped loving her even when they thought she might be lost forever. Eleanor's voice broke as she spoke about the plans she had made for this moment, about the room in her house that had been kept ready for Lila's return, about the college funds and trust accounts that had been maintained in hope of her daughter's recovery. Maya realized that she was not just being reunited with her family. She was inheriting a life that had been carefully preserved and protected, waiting for the day when she would be ready to claim it. The complexity of her emotions threatened to overwhelm her as Maya sat between her past and her future, between the woman who had raised her and the woman who had given birth to her. Eleanor Vance represented everything that Maya Jensen had never known she was missing. But embracing that identity would mean acknowledging the full scope of the crime that had been committed against both of them. It would mean grieving not just for the childhood she had been denied, but for the relationship with her mother that had been stolen along with everything else. The weeks following Maya's reunion with her biological family passed in a haze of legal proceedings, psychological evaluations, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding an identity that had been fractured for over a decade. Eleanor had arranged for Maya to stay in a comfortable suite at one of the city's finest hotels while they navigated the complex transition, understanding instinctively that her daughter needed neutral space to process the seismic shifts in her understanding of herself and her place in the world. Maya found herself caught between two identities, neither of which felt entirely authentic. She was no longer Maya Jensen, the scarred teenager from a modest suburban household. But she wasn't quite ready to embrace being Lila Monroe, the kidnapped heiress whose story had been splashed across newspaper headlines and television screens. The media attention had been overwhelming, requiring Eleanor to hire security personnel and coordinate with law enforcement to protect her daughter's privacy during this vulnerable time. The decision to visit Robert and Helen in prison came after weeks of internal struggle and consultations with the team of therapists Eleanor had assembled to help Maya navigate her trauma. Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in kidnapping recovery cases, had explained that confronting the people who had raised her was often a necessary step in the healing process, but that Maya should only proceed when she felt emotionally prepared for the encounter. The county detention facility was a stark, intimidating building surrounded by razor wire and guard towers, its institutional gray walls designed more for security than comfort. Maya's hands trembled as she passed through the metal detectors and security checkpoints, each procedure serving as a reminder that the people she was about to see were now classified as criminals, rather than the loving parents she had known for 15 years. The visitation room was a sterile space filled with small tables and plastic chairs, monitored by corrections officers, whose presence created an atmosphere of enforced civility. Maya sat alone at one of the tables, her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for the people who had shaped her entire conscious existence to be brought from their cells. Robert entered first, wearing the orange jumpsuit of a county inmate, his familiar face gaunt and aged beyond the few weeks that had passed since his arrest. His eyes, once warm with paternal affection, now carried the hollow look of a man who had lost everything he valued most in the world. Behind him came Helen, her graying hair pulled back severely, her posture defeated in a way that made Maya's chest ache with unwanted sympathy. The sight of them in prison uniforms sent a shock through Maya's system that she hadn't anticipated. These were the people who had taught her to tie her shoes, who had cheered at her school plays, who had comforted her through teenage heartbreaks and celebrated her small victories. Seeing them reduced to the status of convicted felons created a cognitive dissonance that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. Robert's eyes filled with tears the moment he saw Maya, his face crumpling with a mixture of relief and shame that spoke to the complex emotions he had been wrestling with since his confession. Helen's reaction was more controlled but no less profound, her hands clenching and unclenching on the table as she fought against the urge to reach for the daughter she no longer had any right to touch. Maya studied their faces, searching for signs of the deception she now knew had underlain every interaction of her childhood. But instead of finding evidence of criminal calculation, she saw only the raw pain of two people who had made a terrible choice and were now facing the consequences of that decision. The love in their eyes seemed as genuine as it had ever been, which somehow made the situation even more painful to endure. The conversation that followed was halting and emotionally charged, filled with long silences and careful words that seemed inadequate to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. Robert spoke about the genuine affection they had developed for Maya, how quickly their initial criminal intent had been overwhelmed by parental love that felt as real as any biological bond. Helen's apologies came in broken fragments, interrupted by tears, and the visible struggle to find words that could somehow justify the unjustifiable. Maya found herself torn between conflicting emotions that seemed to war within her chest. There was anger, deep, burning fury at the years of lies and the family that had been stolen from her. But there was also gratitude for the care and love she had received, even if it was built on a foundation of crime. These people had genuinely sacrificed for her, had worried about her happiness and future, had provided her with stability and affection during the formative years of her life. As she listened to their explanations and apologies, Maya began to understand that the situation was more complex than simple victim and perpetrator categories could contain. Robert and Helen were criminals who had committed an unforgivable act, but they were also the only parents she had ever known, people who had loved her with a devotion that seemed impossible to fake. This duality would be something she would have to carry with her for the rest of her life. The visit ended with no dramatic reconciliation or complete forgiveness, just a mutual acknowledgement of the complicated truth that bound them together. Maya left the detention center feeling emotionally drained, but somehow lighter, as though facing Robert and Helen had allowed her to begin processing the full complexity of her situation, rather than trying to force it into simpler narratives of good and evil. Meanwhile, her relationship with Eleanor and Dr. Finch was developing slowly, built on a foundation of careful exploration rather than assumed intimacy. Eleanor had converted one of the guest rooms in her elegant home into a space specifically designed for Maya, filled with photographs from Lila's early years and carefully chosen decorations that reflected both the child she had lost and the teenager she was getting to know. The process of building a relationship with her biological mother required Maya to navigate the strange territory of loving someone she barely knew while grieving for the relationship they should have had. Eleanor was patient and understanding, recognizing that her daughter needed time and space to adjust to their new reality. They spent hours looking through old photographs, with Eleanor sharing stories about Lila's early childhood that helped Maya begin to piece together the first 3 years of her life that had been stolen from her. Dr. Finch, now revealed as Uncle Alistair, brought a different kind of comfort to Maya's new family dynamic. His medical perspective on her scar took on new meaning now that she understood his personal investment in her well-being. He explained how he had suspected something was wrong during that first consultation, how his professional instincts had been sharpened by a familial connection he hadn't consciously recognized at the time. The transformation in Maya's perception of her scar was perhaps the most profound change in her new life. Where once she had seen a disfiguring mark that set her apart from her peers, she now understood it as evidence of her survival, a testament to her resilience in the face of trauma. More importantly, it was proof that her real family had never given up looking for her, that the distinctive star-shaped birthmark Eleanor remembered had led to her recovery when nothing else could. Standing before the mirror in her new bedroom at Eleanor's house, Maya traced the familiar contours of the scar that ran from her temple to her jaw. The raised tissue no longer seemed like a burden to be hidden, but rather a map of her journey from victim to survivor. She began to experiment with hairstyles that revealed rather than concealed the mark, finding a strange pride in displaying the evidence of what she had endured and overcome. The legal proceedings against Robert and Helen moved forward with the grinding inevitability of the justice system, their guilty pleas ensuring lengthy prison sentences that would keep them incarcerated well into Maya's adulthood. The civil lawsuits filed by Eleanor's attorneys would result in the forfeiture of the Jensen family assets, though Maya found herself conflicted about the financial consequences for people who had, in their own misguided way, cared for her. As spring arrived and the legal complexities began to settle into routine, Maya found herself looking toward a future that seemed simultaneously overwhelming and full of possibility. Eleanor had enrolled her in a prestigious private school where she could complete her education without the constant reminder of her past life, and they had begun discussing college plans that would have been impossible under the modest circumstances of the Jensen household. But perhaps more importantly, Maya was beginning to understand herself as someone who belonged in the world rather than someone who had been displaced from it. The star-shaped birthmark that had once made her feel marked and different was now a symbol of the love that had never stopped searching for her. The scar that had defined so much of her adolescent identity was evidence of her strength rather than her damage. Standing on the balcony of Eleanor's penthouse apartment, looking out over a city that was slowly becoming home, Maya felt a sense of possibility that she had never experienced as Maya Jensen. She was Lila Monroe, daughter of Eleanor Vance, niece of Dr. Alistair Finch, and survivor of a crime that had tried to steal not just her identity but her future. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with the ongoing work of healing and the challenge of building authentic relationships with her recovered family. But for the first time in her conscious life, Maya felt as though she truly belonged somewhere, as though the person she was meant to be was finally beginning to emerge from the shadow of the person she had been forced to become. We want to hear your opinion about this thrilling story. What do you think will happen with them? Tell us your name, where you are watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new stories coming up. See you next time.